I always start with looking at the basic facts of the fire response from the incident sheet, and then I turn to the photographs.
The defense has examined these same photos and says they support an accidental fire.
This is a close-up shot of the light box sitting on the bed, and behind it you can see where the paneling has burned in layers. It's a fact that if the light bridge was the cause of the fire, it certainly had the capability to ignite the bed to bring the room to flashover.
However, to DeHaan's trained eye, the crime scene photos point to a vastly different scenario.
This is the headboard across here, this dark object, and it's very uniformly burned. In fact, the only place that it's burned more intensely is where some of the ceiling debris has fallen on it. But there's nothing along the headboard to indicate that the fire started in a electrical fitting or light inside the headboard. I eliminated the headboard, the lights in the headboard, based especially on the lack of damage, lack of localized damage to the headboard.
Now DeHaan ponders a single question.
Well, how else do I get an open flame? Well, it could have been an accelerated fire. And the answer is yes. There were identified residues of gasoline, not only in the carpet adjacent to the bed, but in materials recovered from the bed.
And now DeHaan looks for burn patterns, despite the defense's assertion that they can't be seen.
Well, when a flashover happens, it burns floors, and it creates irregular patterns on the floor, which means that you can't be making determinations based on visual observation of fire damage alone at that point.
DeHaan argues it's difficult, but not impossible.
On the edge of the bed and on the carpet adjacent to the bed, the burn patterns there are pretty well obscured because of the massive post-flashover burning, but they were still there. The burn patterns, the behavior of fire were consistent with open flame promoted by gasoline.
It's all coming together for the prosecution. Now DeHaan uses a video from his collection of test fires to illustrate how the alley fire may have occurred.
This is actually very similar to what I think happened in the alley case, because you had some liquid on the floor, you had some on the bed. The flammable liquid basically acts like a big match. It's a really big fire, and the fire only grows if there's enough ordinary combustible material there to keep the fire going. In the alley case, you had all that combustible bedding, and that's what drove the fire, and all it had to do in that case was get the bed to ignite the wall covering. Once that wall covering ignited, there was no stopping that fire.
And it all leads him to one conclusion.
In my opinion, this fire was set deliberately.
Despite DeHaan's analysis that this was indeed an arson fire, the prosecution knows it must tackle the defense's PPV contamination theory head-on.
In this case, I'm certain that firemen themselves were responsible for the gasoline to be in the debris.
Coming up, the prosecution devises their own experiment with the PPV fan itself.
There was no gasoline in any of the samples.
And finally, the state runs through how they believe Pagafrey committed the crime when Forensics You Decide continues. The prosecution believes the fire that killed Amanda Alley was no accident. Kazem Pagafrey used gasoline as an instrument of murder.
No one should die the way she died. Poor girl. The horror to wake up in flames.
But the defense says the fire department is responsible for the gasoline.
I'm certain that firemen themselves were responsible for putting the machine there that caused the gasoline to be in the debris.
The defendant suggested it was contamination by these PPV fans that firemen bring to the scene. That's a bunch of hogwash.
And now Kavanaugh and his team of experts intend to prove it. They start by looking at the placement of the PPV fan used at the scene.
The positive pressure ventilation fan, in this case, was set up a correct distance from the door. And they're usually set up about 6 feet from the doorway. The fan is never brought into the house.
But the defense argues that there was no way to know how or where the PPV was set up, or if it was refueled at the scene.
There was very little, if any, documentation done with respect to the use of this fan. Was it working properly? Was there some sort of fuel leak on the machine?
They don't fuel the fan at the doorway because we don't want gasoline to be spilled. And in this case, the fan was not fueled at the doorway. We had no reason to believe that there was an issue with that fan.
But the prosecution can't just go on the fire department's word. They need tangible proof.
I've never had a fan contaminate a fire scene. But to further prove that the fan didn't contaminate it, we actually had our lab do testing.
Perry Michael Kousiafis of the Florida State Fire Marshal's Office conducts an experiment that simulates how firefighters use a PPV.
This is a standard position for a positive pressure ventilation fan to be set up.
Once the PPV is properly in place outside the building, Kousiafis sets up 3 sets of carbon strips.
These carbon strips should absorb the gasoline vapors from the air, if there are any.
Kousiafis then places 1 set of carbon strips by the base of the fan and the other 2 sets of carbon strips at a test site.
We have one here at the doorway because this is the first spot that any air and vapors from the PPV are going to come in contact with the structure. We're going to have one inside the structure because we're creating our positive pressure inside the structure, so we want to see what's happening inside.
Next, Kousiafis runs the PPV.
We have our carbon strips set up to absorb any vapors that might be coming out of the fan.
Well, we've just shut the fan off, so we're going to take our carbon strip samples, see if any vapors came off right away.
Now, all the carbon strips must be analyzed for traces of gasoline.
I did not find any positive samples. Everything was negative.
Kousiafis' findings clinch the case for the prosecution.
The PPV fan did not contaminate the scene in my experiments.
Finally, after countless hours of investigation, the prosecution pieces out how they believe the events played out that hot July morning.
Kaz left early that morning with the intent to start a fire.
Mr. Pogafori opened the door and splashed gasoline into the room on Amanda, the floor, and you know, it's almost a perfect splash pattern.
Kaz then reached down with a lighter, ignites the gasoline, it flares up, and he singes his hand and his hair.
At that point, Amanda Alley awoke on fire.
And then runs back around the corner where he's left the vehicle, and within a minute or so, he's pulling back up to save the day.
For Kavanaugh, it all makes for a classic case of murder by fire.
The bottom line is, it was evidence of gasoline, and this was an arson, period.
But the defense has a whole other take.
In our view, this was an accidental fire that resulted in the death of Amanda Alley.
Now both sides will present their arguments in front of a jury, and 2 sets of experts will square off on the stand.
You're going to get experts doing battle back and forth whether or not there is gas, there isn't gas, how did the gas get there, how did it didn't get there.
Coming up, what will the jury decide?
My heart was racing when the verdict was read. It was an emotional time for all of us.
Don't miss the dramatic conclusion of Forensics You Decide. Over the last hour, you've heard 2 sides of a tragic story. Did Kazem Pogafre start the deadly blaze that killed his lover, 20-year-old Amanda Alley?
The cause of the fire was arson. The instrumentality used was gasoline.
Or was it a tragic accident?
We provided what we thought was a seamless theory as to how the fire started.
2 teams of experts have squared off.
But there's nothing along the headboard to indicate that the fire started in an electrical fitting inside the headboard.
Some money that Ms. Alley put up on top of the light bridge came in contact with a halogen lamp and ignited.
And two very different experiments stand between a guilty and not guilty verdict.